Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Gear 5th is upon us, and I wanted to share my thoughts on how it all connects to all of what Luffy's been doing throughout the series. Now, it may be obvious for some, but I've also seen some people not completely understand the logical progression from Luffy's base powers to where we are today. So, I thought I'd try and offer a framework for how it all connects in this sort of theory analysis video. So, let's get right into it. Upon introduction, the Gum Gum fruit was said to give the user's body the properties of rubber, and so the most basic usage of this ability would be to stretch and have some sort of immunity to blunt forces or projectiles like bullets and cannonballs. Later on in the series, we would see an inherent immunity to electricity-based attacks, due to rubber being a naturally good insulator. So, how do we get from this rubber-based power set to the ability to bend the laws of physics for both the user and their surroundings? Part of my main assertion here is that the ability of a rubber body has always been the means to the end. The rubber body is simply what allows the user to do what they want to do, and for someone like Luffy, who has such a strong imagination, it allows him to perform these actions as he thinks of them in his head. Now, this is not to say the power of the Gum Gum fruit is reality warping imagination, such as a character like the Scarlet Witch from Marvel Comics, for example. But rather, the fruit facilitates a given action that Luffy thinks of doing. It helps fill in the gaps of logic. Now, pre-Gear 5, this is what the rubber body allowed. If Luffy wanted to punch someone with the impact of a pistol, his rubber body could stretch to apply such force. And we actually get Luffy's imaginative mind in Chapter 1 of the manga, where we see a young Luffy comparing the strength of his punch to that of a pistol even before he ate the Gum Gum fruit. And by the end of the chapter, several years have passed and he's successfully able to perform the technique at full capacity. It should be noted that the fruit doesn't inherently bolster one's strength. It just gives them the ability to carry out their ideas, but their own body still needs to be trained to be capable of doing a given feat. We saw this in action during the Ace Sabo Luffy flashback, where we got a glimpse of Luffy practicing his Gum Gum pistol as he was unable to withstand the residual force of stretching out so far. Also note that he had to train how far he could stretch as well. You may see what I'm getting at here. As we know, Gear 5th is the awakening of the Gum Gum fruit, and we're told by Kaido that Devil Fruit Awakening requires the user's mind and body to catch up with their powers. Luffy has always had the imaginative mind to match the capabilities of his Devil Fruit powers, and it was his body that needed further training, which he underwent throughout the Wano arc as he furthered his mastery of armament haki and its advanced applications, as well as Conqueror's haki. And with all of this together, he was able to unlock his fruit's awakening. With Gear 5, the fruit's rubber capabilities extend not only to Luffy's body, but his surroundings as well, including people. He can do things that he's always wanted to, but he's no longer bound by the limitations of the physical world, as the rubber properties of his fruit are applied to whatever he interacts with, bridging the gaps in logic for his ideations. And due to the mythical nature of its fruit and his awakening, this goes a step further, allowing him what we perceive as Toon Force, or cartoon physics. He is truly free, and the power is truly ridiculous. However, Luffy has always been doing this, just not to the explicit extent of turning his surroundings into rubber. He has always been trying to carry out his wildest ideas through the use of his powers. So, my assertion here is that the Gum Gum fruit's true power allows the user's body to achieve or perform a given feat that they think of, and the explicit way in which it manifests in the physical world is facilitated through the properties of rubber. And now for the fun part. Let's get into some of the examples and the evolution of how we got to Gear 5. Over the years, many fans have noticed that Luffy rarely, if ever, has an internal monologue. And this was even addressed in an SBS question from Volume 54, and we've seen this countless times throughout the series, even to the point of characters around him wondering why he's not keeping certain thoughts to himself. Not only that, despite how imaginative Luffy is, he's not very good at expressing himself through other means, as we've seen with his attempts at art. It's almost as if he has to express himself through his words and actions, and the Gum Gum fruit is perfect for someone like this. I think the most explicit and prevalent thing to point to is Luffy's wide array of techniques that are named after and inspired by various weapons and animals. In general, Luffy's moves are predicated on mimicking or recreating a given concept with his body. And I'd love to talk about all of them at length at some point, but in the effort of keeping this video at a reasonable length, I suggest checking out the One Piece Wiki and scrolling through Luffy's various moves for a comprehensive look if you're interested. Instead, I'd like to talk specifically about the techniques that Luffy has done through improvisation or inspiration. While Luffy does have a core set of moves that he uses in some variation across the series, such as the aforementioned Gum Gum pistol, or the bazooka and the Gatling, etc., The reason why Luffy has so many named attacks is that a lot of them are made up on the spot to match the needs of a given situation. We've seen Luffy take inspiration from the people around him right from the beginning of the series, such as in Arlong Park, when he noticed Genzo's pinwheel, which he had placed atop his head to make Nami laugh, and during their attack on the Arlong pirates, Luffy named his big flashy move the Gum Gum Pinwheel, which was translated to windmill in the English Viz version. During his fight with Arlong, Luffy used the Gum Gum finger net to try and catch the fishmen. This based on the idea of using a net for fish, and while not named, he also mimicked Arlong's use of sharp teeth as a tactic during their fight in the Arlong arc. In the Alabasta arc, we see Luffy try out the Gum Gum Munch Munch, a tactic clearly taken from Wapol, who he had fought in a prior arc. Thematically, Luffy uses the Gum Gum Storm for the first time to defeat Crocodile, in turn restoring the rain to Alabasta. He also deploys the Gum Gum Hook and the Gum Gum Flail to play into the boxing component of the Davy Back fight against Foxy, and after meeting Frankie during his time in Water 7 and Enies Lobby, Luffy tries out a cyborg-inspired technique against the Marines, the Gum Gum Ally Robot. These examples go on and vary between being extremely explicit and being a bit of a stretch. Either way, the general point that I'm trying to make here is that Luffy uses the world around him as inspiration for his techniques, whether that be physical things, people, or even at times, themes and concepts that are found in a given arc. This idea is very reminiscent of the old adage, monkey see, monkey do, which obviously works with the character being named Monkey D. Luffy, but I'll talk more about this connection in just a bit. The way Luffy uses his Devil Fruit is very distinct from how most other Devil Fruit users operate. They tend to have a given number of techniques that they use over and over or to some greater extent, while Luffy has more moves that he's used on a single occasion or second occasion than some fruit users have moves at all. Of course, this is most likely partially a byproduct of Luffy being the main character of the series with the most screen time, but I can't help but think this is also the result of Luffy's ingenuity and imagination coming into play. This is a concept that was first brought up by Crocodile during Luffy's initial bout with the Warlord, where it was suggested that the key to Devil Fruit powers was to continuously iterate and improve upon them, and in order to bring about their full potential. And that's exactly what we see Luffy doing over the course of the series with his gears. But before we dive into that, I have to address Luffy's understanding of the human body. The long and the short of it is, Luffy has a completely messed up understanding of how the human body works, as we've seen throughout the series with his inability to understand how sickness or ailments affect people, such as with Nami after Little Garden, or Cricket during Jaya. He also believes that simply eating meat will heal sustained damage to the body, or that drinking milk will fix a broken tooth. And a recurring gag throughout the series is Luffy's ability to swell up after taking in a large amount of food or water. And in order to return to his original size, he believes all he has to do is expend some energy by engaging in combat or even going for a run. And I believe a lot of this may be explained with his Gum Gum Fruit, with the idea that he believes his body to work in a certain way, and so his fruit fills in the gap of logic and allows that to happen, often to the surprise of the people surrounding him. Of course, his body being rubber allows him to expand and retain a lot of the food that he takes in, and we've seen throughout the series that using his Devil Fruit abilities uses up a lot of energy, which is why his body is able to metabolize food so fast, almost at will. And there are other instances of his body working based on his beliefs or his thinking. For example, in Whole Cake Island, after refusing to eat any food that wasn't made by Sanji and fighting off Big Mom's forces, Luffy shriveled up due to his perceived starvation. But as soon as he reunited with Sanji and ate some more of his cooking, he regained his regular shape. More recently in the series, Luffy's ability to swell up with food intake has been shown to affect those around him as well, as with Kid and Hyogoro in the Udon prison, or Chopper and Bonnie on Egghead. Of course, at face value, this is simply a gag, but this could also be interpreted as the start of the Gum Gum Fruit's latent awakened powers affecting the composition of those around him. The instance of this on Egghead is quite notable, as Luffy, Chopper, and Body regain their original form almost mid-conversation. And as we've seen, Luffy doesn't have a grasp on anatomy or biology. He just believes people's bodies work in certain ways, and so that they must. Overall, the point of bringing all of this up is to suggest the idea that Luffy's body operates how he believes it to, and this is largely facilitated by the Gum Gum Fruit, making the entirety of his body rubber and filling in the gaps of logic that defy a regular human's biology. And this, in conjunction with the previously discussed notion of Luffy using the world around him as inspiration for his techniques, is what allows him to achieve his various gears. With Gear Second, Luffy can use his rubber physicality to pump blood throughout his body at a faster rate than normal, very similar to the real-world idea of blood doping, where more red blood cells carrying oxygen are delivered to the muscles of the body, in turn increasing endurance and athletic capabilities. This allows Luffy to move at greater speeds and deliver blows with much greater force, and with this increase in physical capacity, Luffy is able to perform feats such as mimicking the shave technique used by Cypher Pole for instantaneous movement. Gear Second is the first real step towards Gear Fifth, as this form involves Luffy altering his blood flow and pressure in impossible ways, resulting in steam to come off of his body. This could be seen as the precursor to the cloud-like scarf or Hagoromo that would accompany his appearance in Gear 4th and Gear 5th. And not only that, but with Gear 2nd requiring his body to pump blood in a specific way, it's not unlikely that this altered his heartbeat, though not enough to match the specific rhythm required for Gear 5th. But just when did Luffy get the idea for this application of the Gum Gum fruit? Well, I believe it all started with Crocodile's words back in Alabasta, when Luffy first got the idea to make use of external elements to augment his rubber powers. You see, up until that point, Luffy had been relying solely on his ability to stretch for combat purposes. At times, he would take in air for techniques such as the Gum Gum Balloon for defense, or make use of an enemy's abilities to fight back, such as with Arlong or Mr. 3. But it was during his fight with Crocodile that he realized that he could apply water to his body to combat the warlord's Logi defenses, and by the end of the arc, Luffy had come to the conclusion that he could do the same thing with his own blood. Soon after, Luffy would learn of the bends, also known as decompression sickness, a condition that is caused by air bubbles to form in the muscles and blood, which for regular people causes severe pain and wear on the body, and can even result in death. While Luffy doesn't completely understand this ailment, likely due to his lack of understanding of the human body to begin with, it does strike him as interesting, as he attributes it to being something mysterious, a gag that he used to use a lot more often throughout the series when Luffy didn't fully comprehend a given concept. Nonetheless, the similarities between what Gear Second is doing and what decompression sickness is caused by are uncanny. Both involve the movement of oxygen into the muscles of the body and an increase in pressure that are completely unsuitable for the regular human, but is tolerable for Luffy due to his rubber body. I'm not necessarily saying that Luffy got the exact idea for Gear Second from Cricket. However, it's the lived experience he amassed from his fights with Crocodile, his encounter with Cricket, and his time on Jaya, and even his time on Skypiea, that all contributed to Luffy's ideas of what he could do with his own body. With Gear Second, Luffy adds the word Jet to his attack names to signify the speed at which he moves. This may have been something he picked up after witnessing the power of jet dials in Skypiea, though I will note, in the source material, they are written differently using different characters. But while we're entertaining the idea, there is this really cool parallel between how Gedatsu fights with the jet dial and Luffy's fighting stance taken during Gear Second. Of course, Gedatsu and Luffy didn't ever really interact on Skypiea, but the core idea I'm trying to get at here is that Luffy's techniques are often a reflection of various components of the ideas or the arcs in which he's a part of. This taunt from Blueno about Luffy resembling a steam engine also harkens back to the invention of the Sea Train, which had been the hope for Water 7 back in the day. All of this plays heavily into the idea of monkey see, monkey do, as the phrase describes the act of learning a given concept through mimicking, without necessarily understanding why or how it is done, which is almost exactly what is going on with Luffy in Gear Second. As we've discussed, he doesn't have a grasp on the human body, and he just does what he thinks he can do because his body allows it to happen. Luffy being unable to actually explain or verbalize what he's doing is also suggested by the fact that almost the entirety of the explanation for Gear Second comes from Lucci, not Luffy. Luffy has just been doing this because he thinks he can, not because he necessarily understands what he's doing, as evidenced by his lack of concern for his own body. Gear Third allows Luffy to inflate his bones with air, increasing his size and strength. Before this, we had seen Luffy intake air or water and store it in his torso, effectively acting as a balloon. But with Gear Third, the air seems to compress within his bones, and with this, increases the pressure, translating to actual weight and force. In relation to Gear Fifth, Gear Third is obviously the precursor to his ability to expand and grow in size at will. The idea for Gear Third was likely formed around the same time as the idea for Gear Second, as Luffy was going to debut both during his bout against Blueno. Most explicitly, Gear Third can be seen as a realization after Luffy's encounter with Enel when he was stuck fighting with a giant ball made of gold around his arm, perhaps sparking the idea for recreating that size and impact with his own body. That said, there is another very uncanny instance during the Jaya arc that resembles Luffy's gears. We see Masira, a man that bears a striking resemblance to a monkey, blow air to create a massive air bubble for salvaging ships. This sequence, of course, reminds me a lot of when we first saw Luffy use Gear 3rd, and while I don't think Luffy mimicked Masira's technique or got the idea from him explicitly, especially since we never saw Luffy observe this action in the story, I think this is just another example of Luffy mimicking these ideas or concepts that Oda had seeded into the world of One Piece at large in any given arc. Gear 4th is a form that Luffy takes by blowing air into his muscles instead of his bones and coating himself with armament haki, allowing him far greater strength and speed. Story-wise, I don't think it's an accident that Gear 4th debuted alongside the introduction of Devil Fruit Awakening, as we saw with Doflamingo's String powers. In hindsight, we can see the idea that this form is the most obvious precursor to Gear 5th, with the steam emitted from his body now taking the shape of the Hagoromo as we see in his Gear 5th form, not to mention the proximity and silhouette of his Snake Man appearance to that of Gear 5th's. A very striking difference, though, is that in Gear 4th, his mouth tends to be fixed in a frown, as opposed to the joyous smile that is associated with Gear 5th. Gear 4th is where Luffy really starts to exhibit some feats that are truly deemed as impossible. Despite hardening his body with armament haki, he retains his elasticity and rubber composition, effectively causing his body to be simultaneously hard and soft, and allowing attacks to simply bounce off of him without Luffy feeling their impact. He can also bounce his own attacks off the air and change their trajectory without at all impeding on their momentum, something that makes no sense in any grounded understanding of physics. Unlike his previous gears, we are actually told exactly when Luffy came up with Gear 4th, during his training with Rayleigh on Ruskaina Island across the 2-year time skip. If we go through the various aspects of Gear 4th, we can start to see some of the possible sources of inspiration. Luffy has always been a big fan of transformations, as we've seen with his infatuation with Chopper's abilities, and Franky's giant robot. And we've actually seen Luffy undergo a transformation in the past during the Thriller Bark arc with Nightmare Luffy. This form bears a striking resemblance to Luffy's Gear 4th, with the spiked hair, the emphasized upper body, the perpetual frown, as well as the dark shading around the eyes. But it's hard to say whether this was an inspiration for his appearance in Gear 4th, or if this body shape is a natural byproduct of a human fruit, as Chopper's appearance in hybrid form also looks fairly similar to this as well. Speaking of, I think it's also interesting to note that Chopper had explained that he uses his imagination to swap between his forms, not too far off from what I've suggested that Luffy does to make use of his abilities. This gear has 3 variations: Bound Man, Tank Man, and Snake Man. Tank Man has so far seemed to be a situational technique, used when Luffy ate too much and swelled up. But the differences between Bound Man and Snake Man are very interesting. To me, they remind me a lot of the concept of Life Return, a technique that we first saw used by Kumadori and then Lucci, where the user can consciously control any part of their body. Life Return may actually be what most transformations in this series are predicated on, and even something that Luffy had stumbled upon in his journey by figuring out his gears. Now, that's not to say that everyone who uses transformations have mastered Life Return to the extent that CP9 agents have, but rather they are consciously controlling certain parts of their body in order to transform. Gear 4th also features the use of compression, whereas Luffy tended to rely on stretching. We've seen this utilized a few times across the series by Zoans such as Kaku, but it's also something that Bellamy relies on to use his spring powers. I wouldn't necessarily say it was inspired by any of these things, but once again, it's certainly possible that he took Bellamy's abilities into account when figuring out Gear 4th for himself. This also allows him to kick off the very air itself and stay afloat, very similar to the moonwalk used by Cypherpole. And while I'm here making comparisons with CP9's 6 powers, I would be remiss not to mention how cool I think it is that Luffy's Leo Bazooka bears some resemblance to Lucci's 6 King Punch as seen in his leopard hybrid form. Now, Gear 4th was the culmination of all of Luffy's experiences and techniques throughout Part 1 of the series, pre-time skip, and this would serve him well for most of Part 2, from Dressrosa through the majority of Wano. However, he would need to train his armament haki and Conqueror's haki a bit more in order to finally reach the pinnacle of his power. Gear 5th, the most ridiculous power in every sense imaginable. In this form, Luffy is able to fight in any way he fancies. He can grow in size at will and even extend his rubber properties to his surroundings, including people or intangible things like lightning, and we've even seen him pull things out of his hair. Now for some, this may look a lot like Toon Force or cartoon physics, and I'd agree to an extent. However, Luffy has always been trying to do these things. Gear 5th just lets him and his wacky ideas and imaginative tactics actually be effective. This initial sequence we see of Luffy completely manhandling Kaido by spinning him around and doing this cartoonish bam bam thing was almost exactly what Nightmare Luffy did to Oars. Furthermore, Luffy has always been able to bounce back blunt forces or projectiles in the past, and with his awakening, he can do so against different kinds of attacks now. Strangely enough, we've also seen Luffy be present inside of a giant serpent's eyes before as well. However, he couldn't escape through them in the past, but now he can. Of course, Luffy's Gear 3rd is predicated on growing his limbs to the size of a giant, but in this form, he can apply it to his entire body. Also a cool detail, there had been rumors that Luffy was a giant human to begin with back in Dressrosa. He's treated his opponents like rope or string, as we saw when he tied up the Boa sisters, and in Gear 5th, he has the ability to do this to a greater extent by growing in size and handling Kaido like a jump rope. His natural immunity to electricity is taken a step further, as he can now grab hold of lightning and use it as a projectile. Luffy has also spun his legs with so much momentum, as we saw with the Gum Gum UFO, and this is exactly what he does with his Gum Gum Dawn Whip. Albeit, he still can't really control his momentum. The Gum Gum Munch Munch didn't really work out against Crocodile, but now it has enough destructive force to crumble the ground. And not only that, we've seen Luffy spit out things as projectiles before, where back then it was mildly annoying, but now they seem to have the capacity to do actual damage. And as far as the pocket dimension stuff goes with pulling things out of his hair, I will say, we've seen Luffy do similar things with fitting huge pieces of meat into his pockets that somehow retain their shape. Though I will note, as far as we've seen, this seems to simply be for stylish or comedic effect, as it hasn't really had an impact on his fights. And I'm sure there are countless more examples. The beauty of Gear 5th is that it works on both the diegetic and meta level. It brings smiles to the faces of the people reading it, as well as the characters in the story itself. Oda managed to give Luffy a power that is the very essence of what manga, comics, and cartoons are at their core, what they all came from. If you think this is too cartoonish, that's largely the point. Early One Piece is heavily influenced by Western animation, especially Disney, and even if the connections between Luffy's rubber body and the rubber hose animation as seen in cartoons wasn't explicitly thought out to begin with, the logical progression here is undeniable. It may be hard to convince some people, but it's definitely somewhere in between genius and crazy to give your character a power set based on the very medium that you are creating. What gets depicted to us as readers as mere conventions of manga or comics, such as the spinning eyes or the dazing birds, is part of this character's abilities. But there's a certain humor and joy to that of course works well with the greater mythology of Joy Boy and the sun god Nika. Most shonen series, especially one of One Piece's era, tend to start out a lot more lighthearted, and even border on being gag manga. Over time, they become more serious and develop into these edgier, high-stakes stories about good versus evil. Gear 5th is a reminder to us as readers why we all started engaging with One Piece to begin with, because we fell in love with the goofy, wacky antics of Luffy and his crew. The anime definitely amps up the cartoonish nature of Gear 5th even more, with the zany sound effects and the wild, wacky animations, paying homage to a variety of cartoons from the decades prior. And I understand that some people may fear that this means every battle will just become some Looney Tunes shenanigans against the big bad. And I hate to break it to these people, but it always was. Maybe not to this explicit extent, but it is a recurring gag at this point with how often people against and around Luffy don't think he's taking things seriously, when in truth, he always is. And at the end of the day, how he defeats an enemy will likely never change. He's always just going to punch them harder. Before I wrap up with this video, I do want to address the Zoan thing. For the longest time, we as readers believed Luffy to be a paramecia, just based on how his powers worked. And people may even point to the instance where Luffy himself said that he wasn't a Zoan. However, in the source material, Luffy was just told that he was a paramecia by his opponents, and as I've shown today, Luffy just believes certain things about his body. He thinks it works that way just because it does. If we look back, there are certain things that should raise an eye. For example, during the Arlong Park arc, Luffy was submerged underwater, but still retained his rubber body. Of course, we as readers wouldn't really think much of it at the time, but at a certain point, we should have realized there's something off about this, that it doesn't behave like a regular paramecia. There's also been comments about how Zoans work that very much align with how Luffy's been depicted, with the key strength of Zoan fruits being the ability to further strengthen your physical attacks, as we've seen with Luffy and his gears. Funny enough, Moria has also briefly suggested Luffy having the ability to transform when he saw Nightmare Luffy, which later would turn out to be true. And some people like to cite that line from Lucci saying that eating a fruit should tell you its name, but this was not a proper translation from back in the day, as this line is more so referring to the idea of knowing what the fruit can do. And I think personally one of the biggest giveaways throughout the series was Chopper. I've already talked about how Chopper's human form somewhat resembles Nightmare Luffy, but more recently, we've seen Chopper revert to an elderly baby form after using his monster point through unnatural means. This is very similar to Luffy's initial drawback of reverting to a childlike chibi form after using Gear 3rd. I'm not saying this is a one-to-one connection, but at the very least, this makes a bit of sense now considering that Luffy actually had a human fruit as well. And there's a couple more, but these are the big instances that I wanted to talk about in this video. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching and hearing out my stupid musings about Gear 5th and the Gum Gum Fruit. This is a sort of different video from the evidence-based breakdowns I usually do week to week, as this is more like a theory or analysis video, but I wanted to share my thoughts on Gear 5th while the fandom at large is experiencing it for the first time. I've been thinking about the Gum Gum Fruit's abilities through this framework for about a year or so now, just trying to make sense of everything and how it connects and progresses from one ability to the next, so I'd love to know what you think. I'm not standing firm by this as what's like actually happening or anything like that, but more so just pointing out these cool thematic and logical connections. And if you have someone in your life that was blindsided by Gear 5th and thinks it's nonsense, maybe this will help them see it in a better light. I will note this is probably the first of 2 videos that I'll make about Gear 5th and the Gum Gum Fruit. This one is more about the power set itself, whereas the next one will be about the mythology of it, such as Joy Boy, the sun god Nika, the fruit's real name, etc. If you like this video, please do let me know. I'd be down to try more of these in the future. And if you like the content on this channel in general, I'd really appreciate you subscribing. It goes a long way toward helping the channel grow, and there's so much coming in the near future with the manga, the anime, and especially the live action, which I'll be breaking down in detail as soon as it drops. So, if you want to stick around for that, definitely consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for all your support, and as always, I hope to see you in the next one.